In the decades following the tumultuous gold rushes of the mid-19th century, the colony of Victoria attempted to fundamentally reshape its vast, newly acquired landscapes. The colonial government in Melbourne introduced a series of complex land acts designed to break the powerful monopoly of the squatters, the wealthy, established pastoralists who had claimed massive tracts of the most fertile country for their sprawling sheep runs. The new legislation aimed to open the land to selectors, poorer, working-class families who were encouraged to claim smaller parcels of land to clear, fence, and farm. However, the reality of this agrarian dream was profoundly flawed, particularly in the rugged, heavily forested northeast of the colony, around the towns of Greta, Mansfield, and Benalla. The prime agricultural land along the river valleys had already been thoroughly secured by the squatter elite through legal loopholes and deep political influence. Consequently, the immigrant selectors, many of them Irish Catholics fleeing generational poverty, were pushed into the marginal, unforgiving foothills of the ranges. The soil was poor, the timber was virtually impenetrable, and the climate was prone to devastating droughts and sudden floods. It was an environment that bred immense physical hardship and a deep, simmering resentment toward the colonial authorities who seemed to constantly favor the wealthy landholders. This socio-economic divide was sharply enforced by the Victoria Police. In the northeast districts, the police force was heavily utilized not just for maintaining basic law and order, but for actively suppressing the struggling selector class and protecting the valuable property of the squatters. The local police were often poorly trained, inadequately paid, and deeply corrupt, relying on a network of paid informants and targeted harassment to maintain their tenuous authority over the bush. Among the families caught in this grinding cycle of poverty and relentless police surveillance were the Kellys. Led by the fiercely independent matriarch Ellen Kelly following the early death of her ex-convict husband, the family occupied a meager, struggling selection at 11 Mile Creek near Greta. The Kellys supplemented their failing agricultural efforts with sly grog selling and the widespread local practice of livestock theft, commonly known as duffing. The squatters viewed the extended Kelly clan as a persistent, criminal nuisance, while the local police saw them as an easy, highly visible target for continuous, aggressive scrutiny. Edward Ned Kelly, the eldest son, grew up in this crucible of frontier tension. He was a physically imposing, highly intelligent young man who deeply absorbed the bitter Irish Republican grievances of his community and quickly developed a profound hatred for the colonial police force, which he viewed as an occupying army designed to crush his people. The simmering hostility between the Kelly family and the Victoria Police inevitably reached a catastrophic breaking point in April 1878. The catalyst was an encounter at the Kelly homestead involving a young, ambitious, and notoriously unreliable police constable named Alexander Fitzpatrick. Fitzpatrick arrived at the impoverished selection claiming to hold an arrest warrant for Ned's younger brother, Dan Kelly, on outstanding charges of horse stealing. The exact sequence of events that unfolded in the cramped, dimly lit cabin remains one of the most hotly contested incidents in Australian history. According to the official police narrative, Ned Kelly suddenly appeared and ambushed Fitzpatrick, shooting him in the wrist without any provocation. The Kelly family vehemently maintained that Ned was hundreds of miles away in New South Wales at the time, and that Fitzpatrick had instigated the violence by aggressively making drunken, highly inappropriate advances toward Ned's younger sister, Kate, prompting a physical scuffle in which the constable injured his own hand on the door frame. Regardless of the absolute truth of the violent altercation, the colonial justice system moved with swift, uncompromising severity against the selector family. While Ned and Dan Kelly immediately fled into the dense, inaccessible timber of the Wombat Ranges to avoid capture, the police heavily armed themselves and arrested their mother, Ellen Kelly, along with 2 associates, charging them with the attempted murder of a police officer. In a heavily publicized trial presided over by the notoriously harsh Judge Redmond Barry, Ellen Kelly, who held a newborn baby in her arms in the dock, was sentenced to 3 long years of hard labor. For Ned Kelly, hiding in the freezing mountain scrub, the imprisonment of his mother on what he firmly believed to be the perjured testimony of a corrupt constable was an unforgivable, absolute outrage. It shattered any remaining possibility of a peaceful resolution or a quiet surrender to the authorities. The Fitzpatrick incident permanently transformed the Kelly brothers from local, small-time horse thieves into heavily armed, desperate fugitives, setting the stage for a violent, escalating confrontation that would soon consume the entire colony and birth its most enduring, polarizing historical legend. Deep within the impenetrable, densely timbered fastness of the Wombat Ranges, Ned and Dan Kelly sought refuge from the colonial authorities during the bitter winter of 1878. They were soon joined by two close friends from the local selector community, the fiercely loyal Joe Byrne and the young, impulsive Steve Hart. Together, these four young men formed a highly mobile, incredibly resourceful unit that possessed an intimate, unparalleled knowledge of the rugged northeastern terrain. They survived by utilizing a vast, silent network of sympathizers, family members, friends, and fellow impoverished selectors who shared their deep-seated animosity toward the police and the squatter class. These sympathizers provided vital intelligence, food, and ammunition, creating an invisible shield that allowed the fugitives to move undetected through the bush. In response to this defiance, the Victoria Police organized several heavily armed, mounted search parties with explicit orders to track down the Kelly brothers and bring them to justice. One such party, commanded by Sergeant Michael Kennedy and consisting of constables Thomas Lonergan, Michael Scanlon, and Thomas McIntyre, ventured deep into the wilderness and established a secluded camp at a place called Stringybark Creek. The Kellys, utilizing their superior bushcraft, discovered the police camp before the officers realized they were being hunted. On October 26, 1878, Ned Kelly made a fateful, disastrous decision. Intending to disarm the police and steal their horses and superior weapons to secure their own survival, the gang ambushed the camp while Kennedy and Scanlon were away scouting. They surprised McIntyre and Lonergan, demanding their immediate surrender. While the unarmed McIntyre wisely complied, Lonergan, who had previously clashed violently with Ned Kelly in Benalla, drew his revolver and attempted to run for cover behind a log. In a split-second reaction that would forever alter Australian history, Ned Kelly fired a single, fatal shot, killing Lonergan instantly. When Kennedy and Scanlon returned to the camp shortly after, a chaotic, desperate firefight erupted among the tall eucalyptus trees. Scanlon was killed almost immediately in the crossfire. Sergeant Kennedy, a highly respected and brave officer, engaged in a running gun battle with the gang through the dense scrub for over a quarter of a mile before he was mortally wounded and subsequently executed by Ned Kelly. Only Constable McIntyre managed a miraculous, frantic escape on a terrified horse, carrying the horrifying news back to civilization. The violent encounter at Stringybark Creek marked a permanent, irrevocable point of no return. The Kellys were no longer merely rebellious horse thieves. They were now the most wanted, heavily hunted murderers in the British Empire. The colonial government in Melbourne reacted to the Stringybark Creek massacre with unprecedented legislative fury. In November 1878, the Victorian Parliament passed the Draconian Felons Apprehension Act, officially declaring Ned Kelly, Dan Kelly, Joe Byrne, and Steve Hart to be outlaws. This extraordinary legal status meant that they were stripped of all fundamental legal rights. They could be legally shot and killed on sight by any citizen without consequence or trial. Furthermore, a massive, staggering financial reward of £8,000 was placed on their heads, an astronomical sum designed to tempt even their most loyal sympathizers into betrayal. Recognizing that they could not simply hide indefinitely while their families and friends were continually harassed and imprisoned by the desperate police force, the Kelly gang fundamentally changed their strategy. They went on the offensive, utilizing sheer audacity to fund their survival and publicly humiliate the authorities. In December 1878, they executed a flawless, bloodless bank robbery in the town of Euroa, locking the bank manager and his family in a storeroom while they calmly absconded with over £2,000. 2 months later, they struck even further afield, crossing the border into New South Wales to capture the entire town of Jerilderie. They locked the local police force in their own cells, dressed in their uniforms, and systematically robbed the Bank of New South Wales. However, the Jerilderie raid was not merely a financial endeavor, it was a deeply political act. Ned Kelly brought with him a massive, highly emotive document known as the Jerilderie Letter. Dictated to Joe Byrne, this extraordinary manifesto was a searing, articulate indictment of the colonial justice system, the rampant police corruption, and the systematic oppression of the Irish Catholic selector class by the wealthy English squatters. Kelly demanded the immediate release of his mother and threatened catastrophic violence against the police if his people continued to be persecuted. By distributing this letter, Kelly effectively transformed himself in the eyes of the rural poor from a common criminal into a powerful, romanticized symbol of agrarian resistance. The colonial authorities, thoroughly humiliated by the gang's incredible mobility and widespread public support, realized they were no longer simply fighting a gang of outlaws, but struggling to suppress a brewing social revolution across the northeastern frontier. For 18 months, the Kelly gang remained at large, a ghostly presence frustrating the combined police forces of two colonies. But by June 1880, the immense pressure of the manhunt and the escalating harassment of their sympathizers forced Ned Kelly into a final gamble. The gang's strategy shifted from evasion to direct confrontation. They intended to strike a fatal blow against the Victoria police and spark a broader rebellion across the northeast. The catalyst for this ultimate escalation was the assassination of Aaron Sherritt, a former friend and police informant. Knowing that Sherritt's death near Beechworth would immediately draw a heavily armed special police train from Melbourne, the gang rode south to the small railway town of Glenrowan. Here, they meticulously executed the next phase of their plan, tearing up the railway track's position over a deep ravine, intending to send the anticipated police train plunging to its destruction. To maintain total control over the situation and prevent warnings from reaching the approaching authorities, the gang took the entire population of Glenrowan hostage, confining over 60 civilians within the cramped walls of the Glenrowan Inn. It was during this tense occupation that the gang revealed the extraordinary secret they had developed. Using stolen plough moldboards supplied by their network of sympathizers, they had forged crude, heavy suits of bulletproof armor. Each suit weighed roughly 40 kilograms, consisting of a breastplate, backplate, apron, and a cylindrical helmet with a narrow viewing slit. This armor was not an act of medieval romanticism, but a calculated tactical innovation designed to allow them to survive the intense volley of rifle fire they expected when they confronted the surviving police from the wrecked train. However, the gang's grand plan began to unravel due to a critical miscalculation. In a moment of misplaced trust, Ned Kelly allowed the local schoolteacher, Thomas Curnow, to leave the inn with his wife. Under the cover of darkness, Curnow bravely flagged down the approaching special train with a red scarf and a lantern, warning the police of the torn tracks and the ambush waiting ahead. The element of surprise was instantly lost. Instead of a derailed train and a decimated police force, the Kelly gang found themselves completely surrounded by heavily armed, vengeful troopers. As Sunday morning broke on June 27, 1880, a fierce, relentless siege began. Volley after volley of police rifle fire tore through the thin wooden walls of the Glenrowan Inn, terrifying the hostages inside and pinning the outlaws down. The police, acting with brutal indiscriminateness, continued to fire into the building despite the known presence of innocent civilians, resulting in several tragic casualties. In the pre-dawn darkness of Monday, June 28, the siege reached its surreal, violent climax. Ned Kelly, having slipped out of the inn earlier in the night, returned to attack the police lines from the rear. Clad entirely in his heavy iron armor, he emerged from the freezing winter mist like a mechanical apparition. The police, initially terrified by the seemingly invincible figure that deflected their bullets with dull metallic thuds, eventually realized that his legs and arms were unprotected. A police sergeant fired a shotgun blast into Kelly's exposed thighs, bringing the iron outlaw crashing to the ground. Inside the inn, the situation had grown entirely hopeless. Joe Byrne died from a bullet to the groin. As the authorities set fire to the building to force a conclusion, Dan Kelly and Steve Hart chose to die inside, their bodies consumed by the flames, though the exact circumstances of their deaths remain a subject of historical debate. The consequence of the Glenrowan siege was the absolute destruction of the Kelly gang and the end of the bushranger era. Ned Kelly, severely wounded but alive, was transported to Melbourne to face trial. His trial was a public spectacle, culminating in a dramatic exchange with Judge Redmond Barry, the magistrate who had sentenced his mother. Despite a massive public petition bearing tens of thousands of signatures begging for clemency, Kelly was sentenced to hang. On November 11, 1880, at the Melbourne jail, Ned Kelly met his end with the stoic final words, "Such is life." The execution silenced the man, but it entirely failed to extinguish the legend. The Victoria Police faced a scathing royal commission that exposed widespread corruption, validating many grievances outlined in the Jerilderie letter. Ned Kelly passed into folklore not merely as a convicted murderer, but as a deeply polarizing symbol of anti-authoritarianism and class struggle.